the thing is that it's registrations online are highly unreliable if they are just free registration. If all it takes is a tap, then people will just tap in any which ways, right? So from that standpoint, I don't measure us that, but then sometimes it's indicative that how many people might come in. So I would say 20 is pretty good, because then there's a good chance that 5-6 people might come in over here. But there are a lot more people actually seeing live stream on YouTube. Like YouTube is a much more accessible platform, people to just passively listen to what is happening. So many a times questions and comments come in from that space as well, which is why then they send it out there. Anyhow, I'm told that we are live. So people who are on YouTube and watching us on any other live stream, we'll start in a couple of minutes. Just waiting for a few people to, those who are on their way, list sipping their cup of coffee or tea or making their last bit and joining us, just waiting for them to come in, and then we'll start. Until then, Karl, how is it that you get to, how do you focus on work when you're staying in Goa, man? I mean, I've never associated Goa with work.
Yeah, that's the $1 million question. Yeah. Yeah, but I think the what do you say? The image of Goa is changing a bit. I mean, we have a long way to go before we become like even something like Bangalore or any of the other metros for sure. But I think like there is a lot of progress, especially like in the tech space. Like we have a lot more startups now. A lot of them are getting like funding and stuff like that. So the scene is changing slowly.
I do remember there was a period of time where every company wanted to open an office in Himachal and Goa.
Yes,
two places. So everyone would open a small office in Dharamshala or those areas and one office in Goa. And I think some people I know have actually permanently moved to Goa. I wonder if the quality of life is actually good there as compared to metros and all. Is that the draw, or why do people move to Goa other than the fact that there's a Goa fascination for everyone, because we consider that as a tourist spot, at least I do.
Right. Yeah, I think in my mind, like I think it's more about maybe like quality of life. I think everything is a bit less costly than the metros, and then obviously the air is a lot cleaner here and less traffic. So I mean, in general, you spend a lot less time getting to work, commuting. And then like you have the thing that on the weekends, some of the nicest beaches in India are like literally 10 minutes, 15 minutes away, at least for me.
Yeah.
So that's always
amazing.
Nice to have. Yeah.
So can you imagine moving to Goa?
I can't. I recently went to Galgibaga, which was like
nice.
it was so beautiful. Like I think I'm going to do my first getaway after like things normalize is going to be there. Like I found a good Airbnb there. It's literally lined with trees. It's not like there are no shacks, nothing. It's really
So Galgibag is at the south of Goa, like almost the southernmost tip. And if you're going there again, there's another beach very close to that called Agonda, which I highly recommend. I think Agonda is the best that Goa has. It's like totally secluded, and I shouldn't be saying this, but it's totally secluded. And,
I also feel like by bringing this up right now, we're kind of like removing that seclusion aspect. I also like no, keep Galgibaga a secret.
Yeah.
It's been more than a decade that I have been to Goa, and I would really like this conversation definitely makes me want to go back there. But at this point of time, we are at 11:04. So let's just start with Content Web, what we are here for. So hi everyone, I'm Souvik. I have been co-organizing Content Web conversations since May. And this is a space where we are doing an online series of freewheeling chat for people who create or maintain Content Web based websites, websites that are publishing heavy, typically CMS driven, marketing sites, media sites, e-commerce sites. All these come under the larger umbrella of Content Web. There are three major practices that come together to build any content sites, which is the content teams, content strategists, copywriters, designers, developers, front end and back end. And we intend to have all these three practices come together under the Content Web series and keep having a weekly conversation on different subjects and topics. Another pillar is obviously the website owners, who are people who have their own sites That can be businesses, individuals, publishers, and all. They'll also have a certain set of business functions to learn, like strategy, marketing, analytics, and many other things around that bit. So hopefully to that also we'll get to at a certain point of time. If you have any ideas around what topics we can talk about and what topics we should take up, please go to hasgeek.com/contentweb and post in your proposal or your ideas out there. But coming back to today's conversation, firstly, we have two people today, which is a little unlike other content web conversations. The first person we have is Hamsa, who's going to be moderating the conversation. Hamsa, would you like to introduce yourself?
Hi, I'm Hamsa, and I'm a communication designer turned web designer over the last 5 years. And I work on a lot of content websites. So, this particular content web thing is super exciting for me to be part of. And this is my first time moderating a session, so wish me luck.
All right. So, in case you haven't watched Hamsa's session on responsive grids, it was a amazing insight into how modern responsive design happens. And I highly encourage you to have a look at that talk, which is also hosted on hasgeek.com/contentweb. It happened a couple of weeks back, I think. Also today, the person who will be speaking and giving us the most gyan is Karl. Karl, would you like to introduce yourself?
Thanks, Avik. Yeah, hi, my name is Karl. I'm a product designer. Actually, my discipline is product design, but the content web is something that I've been fascinated with, like since I got into web design, and the topic for today as well is something which I am very, very passionate about. So, yeah, I'm happy to be here. Thanks for
so
this
what is the
opportunity.
topic for today, Karl? What will you be speaking about?
Yeah, so the topic for today is something very close to my heart. It's web typography. So we're going to be talking about like all things related to the web fonts, typesetting, all of that sort of stuff.
I'm really glad that we are able to bring in speakers to talk on topics which are close to their heart, because it's a very similar thing that happened, kind of deja vu. All right, so Karl, who's going to benefit the most from the conversation we're going to have today? Who are you thinking would learn the most?
Yeah, so in my mind, when I submitted the proposal, I think it was two main cohorts. One would be, one would be just any like designers who are just getting into web design, who are not very familiar with how the web works, and in that sense to get a better understanding of typography on the web. And I think the second cohort could also be like maybe experienced designers, maybe you're very experienced with print design or industrial design, but you're just getting into the web. So you have good knowledge of typography, but you don't know how that translates to the digital medium. So these two cohorts, I think, would benefit from today's session.
Right, perfect. So I'll just give a few instructions and then I'll move out of this session and let Hamsa take over. Few instructions for everyone who's attending from YouTube or Zoom or any other live stream channel, wherever you are. First 20 to 25 minutes, we are going to have Karl run through a presentation. We'll not try to interject that or give him a clean time to complete the things that he's he has already planned and prepared for. Beyond the 20-25 minutes, it will open up for Q&A and Hamsa will be conducting that. If you are on YouTube, you can put in your questions on the comment box and it will be forwarded to us on Zoom. But if you want to ask the question directly, I would recommend come over to the Zoom call that we are doing at this point of time, wherein you can raise your hand, ask your question using the chat box and all, and just wait for your turn until Hamsa asks you to come in, unmute yourself and talk. That's all from my side. And at this point of time, I'll over to you, Hamsa, and over to you, Karl, so that you can do the conversation.
Super. Karl, I'm super excited to hear about what you are going to say about this, and especially with your sneak peek of the slide on Twitter. That was really, really exciting. So I can't wait for you to start. So you can go ahead and share your screen and take it over.
All right, let's do this. Okay, so I'm assuming you can see my screen and you can hear me loud and clear. So welcome everyone. Welcome again to this session on web typography. So I have a lot to kind of cover today, and I've kind of going to really limit myself to 25 minutes. I really don't want to stretch it beyond that. So there's a lot of stuff, as you can see, that I'll try to cover. But I really want to spend time mostly on sections 3 and 4, which is, I think, the reason why most of you have joined today. So we'll be talking about typeface selection, and also the whole issue of licensing and deploying fonts right on the web, which is something I think we don't really speak about too much. Um, so let's spend more time on those two sections. I'm going to kind of breeze through the first two, but I think it's kind of important that we talk about them because in a topic like this, it's always good to start with why. So why the fuss about fonts and why this session? What is so special about typography on the web? Many of you may have probably read this seminal article from Oliver Reichenstein. It was written many years ago, in which he says, 95% of the information on the internet is written language. 95%, right? So the article was kind of written many years ago. So you could probably say that, well, we have Flickr and we have Instagram and YouTube, right? So does this still hold water? Is it still 95%? I would kind of agree and say yes, maybe not 95%, maybe lesser, but definitely in the context of the content web, which is the space that we are talking about here, right? So the content web is e-commerce sites and content-heavy websites, marketing sites, blogs, news sites. Within this particular space, I think definitely 95% of it of design is typography. And if you look at the actual, the purpose of typography, he says in the same article, Oliver writes, we have one duty as designers, and that is to convey what the site is trying to say, like convey information in writing. And if you're not doing that, with your fancy fonts or whatever you plan to do, your site or your blog is without purpose, right? So we just have one duty. And the second thing I would say is that since 95% of the web is typography, then we need to take it a bit more seriously, right? And a lot of brands, I think almost all the brands today, the big ones, have kind of understood that typography is in essence a core extension of your brand's visual identity, right? I mean, if you think about it, there are just so few vectors on which you can differentiate your brand from another brand. You have color, you have typography, right? You have to some extent you have white space and layout and margins and padding and that sort of stuff. And maybe I would say also like your aesthetic, your aesthetic flourishes, like your style of illustration or the way that you treat photography and stuff like that. But just a handful of vectors, and typography is one of the most important ones. So the big tech companies realized this, I think, many years ago. Google in 2015 announced that they were working on their own typeface family, internal one. It started off as Roboto, I think. Now they call it Production. It's used everywhere, all across their whole ecosystem. Same with Apple. Apple started with San Francisco, and now they have New York, which is their serif display face, again used all over the place. And it was just a matter of time before all the other guys jumped in, right? Netflix and Airbnb and all the rest. And Netflix uses Netflix which is their own custom face, everywhere, from the billboards in Times Square, to your consoles that you actually watch Netflix on at home. Same with Airbnb. I don't know how many of you remember this particular one. Hamza, maybe you do. This was a microsite called Lost World's Fairs, again from 2010. So the story here is that Typekit at that time was one of the leading players for typography. They commissioned this website as their way of saying, like, look, we have these hundreds and thousands of typefaces, see what we can do with it. And I think they commissioned Jason Santamaria for this particular page. But essentially, they were saying 10 years ago, this is what we could do. This is like literally 10 years old. And if you look at the site, all of that text there is actually selectable, which was a big deal, given 10 years ago, the kind of spotty support that we had for web fonts in terms of browsers. So what I'm trying to say is that imagine if we could do this, 10 years ago with web fonts. Imagine like the possibilities we have today. The possibilities open to any brand. but it wasn't always like that. The kind of widespread adoption that we have today, it wasn't always the case. It was very different some time back. And I'm really kind of going to breeze through this part because all the designers starting with web design today, you guys don't have to really bother about any of this stuff, because today you just use font face and everything just works. But anyone remembers the time of web safe font stacks? It was absurd to think about this. I can only use the fonts that ship with my OS. Oh my God! So if you're on Windows, you had Georgia, you had Times New Roman, and a few others, Arial. If you were on Mac OS, you had Helvetica and just a few others. Nothing else. That's all you could use. But then being designers, we started kind of getting antsy about it, and we said, what else can we do? And someone said, let's use images, right? So we started image replacement. So that was a thing for some time. But then, with that, we quickly realized again that updating the site is so tedious. I need to go back into Photoshop, typeset the text there, create a slice, update my server. It is a real pain. So how could we automate that? Someone said, let's use Flash, which kind of solved it to some extent. But now it brought in a lot more problems, because now you needed both Flash and JavaScript, right? As if JavaScript was not enough. Now you needed Flash too. And obviously it had adverse effects on performance. And I think the main reason this particular method didn't take off was because the foundries and the designers could never sort out the licensing issue. So people were sharing these SWF files all over the place. They were just being freely downloaded, and everyone was just like totally misusing it. So this never really took off. So all these methods I'm sharing, I've actually used at some point of time. I'm sure Souvik and others also have used them. Hamza, maybe you have too. This was, I think, the last one before we got to web fonts. This was like people saying, let's chuck the Flash, just use JavaScript. And so we had these font maps. So if you look at this here, you have something called, a font map. So people used to take fonts, generate, font maps out of them as JavaScript objects, and then render that on a canvas element. So again, a lot of complex processing. You couldn't use it for a lot of text. And the licensing was still kind of a bit, sketchy. So long story short, it has taken us as an industry 10 long years to transition from what we started off with, web safe fonts, to where we are today, web fonts. 10 long years. And today it's just this. Literally anyone, any designer can just go to something like a Google Fonts, copy paste that code from there, just make a font family declaration in your CSS, font family XYZ, and it just works, right? It's selectable, it's copyable. You don't need JavaScript anymore. It's fully accessible. And we kind of have, consensus in terms of licensing. The foundries and stuff have got licensing covered now. So this is the way forward, right? So we'll talk about licensing in the last section. In terms of formats, we have many that we used to use before. So if you remember font face declarations, like even from 4 or 5 years ago, we had to actually serve all of these 4 different variants depending on what devices our users had. So OTF and TTF are like the desktop versions, the desktop font formats. Internet Explorer being Internet Explorer, they said, no, we need our own format. So that's EOT for you. Then you had SVG, which was for mobile users. So I'm not going to, get into details with all of this again. If at all, any of you are interested, we could maybe cover this during Q&A. But today, it's safe to say that we have a web open font format. And that's the path forward. The W3C and the other kind of governing bodies have more or less agreed that this is what everyone should use. And the browser support is very, very good for these two as well. So today you just basically need to use, one of these two. So now that we've kind of got a little context about, what these fonts are, and we have these hundreds and thousands of fonts available at our disposal, right? So how do we actually go about using them? How do we select them? How do we go about with typesetting? There have been books written about this subject, and I really don't want to, get into details here. I'm going to try to keep it like broad at a high level, and keep it to the context of the content web, right? So I'd say, from my experience, keep it simple and just start off with a body face and a display face, right? Keep it simple: body face, display face. So what is a body face and a display face, you might ask? Um, so it's kind of simple. So these are some examples of body faces, right? So what are body faces? Any typeface which is meant to be used, it's designed in such a way that it works really well at small sizes, is a body face. Okay, how small? 18 pixels and lower, 20 pixels and lower, right? For the internet, something in that range, 80 to 20. Anything below that is a body face. So here you have three of my favorites, from different foundries. So you might ask, what make these good body faces? They have certain characteristics that you can look out for. Again, I don't want to, I can geek about this for like an hour, but I have to restrain myself in the interest of time. But a few things to look out for when you're trying to identify a body face. The first thing you can see is here. You can see the lowercase a. So there is something called X height. How tall are your lowercase letters compared to your ascenders? So L is an ascender. It has an ascender here. So here you can see the A is over 50% as tall as the L. So that means it has a large X height. Any typeface that has a large X height is good, at small sizes. That means if you make, this particular font at 14 pixels or 16 pixels, it's going to be legible. It's going to be readable. You have something called apertures. If you can see here, there is a wide gap between the endings of the E, which means, again, if you make the E very small, it will be discernible as an E and not like some other alphabet. So that's an example of wide apertures. You have something called counters. If they're small, it's not readable at small sizes. You need something like this, a large O, very round, almost geometric kind of O, which works well at small sizes. And then here I've just taken Kohinoor as an example of a non-Latin face. This is a Devanagari face. There is something called stroke contrast. Okay, does the thickness of the stroke vary as you go over the letter? Right. So as you see here, it's kind of very, very uniform. So this is an example of an unmodulated face. There is no kind of difference in thickness. So any face with low contrast works well at small sizes. You'll see what some of these things mean when I show you display faces and how different they are. So keep in mind all the things that I just said and kind of compare it with this. You saw Elena from process type, large X height and low contrast. This is an example of high contrast. So this is play fair display. I mean, the name itself says it, it's a display face. So if you look at the E here, the horizontal bar on the E is razor thin, compared to the rest. Here it's like super thick, right? If you look at the horizontal bar on the F, compare that with how meaty and how kind of, almost like a bulb the serif is, same for all the rest of the alphabets. There is like such a contrast between certain strokes. So imagine if you typeset a whole paragraph of this at 14 pixels or 16 pixels using Playfair display, you'll almost kind of see waves on your paragraph, because it's like thick stroke, thin stroke, thick stroke, thin stroke. You can almost see like waves, and it's kind of very distracting, right? And it doesn't really read well. So any typeface with high stroke contrast is not a good choice for small sizes. It's only to be used at large sizes like 48 pixels, 64 pixels, large sizes. And that's what all these are. These are all display faces. They are meant to be used only at large sizes. Similarly for the E, look at this gap here. It's super thin. If you compare it to this E from TISA and look at the E from Avantgarde, if you make this E like 14 pixels, it will look like an O with a dash through it. It won't even look like an E. Similarly here, at small sizes, this will read Ooper instead of copper, because again, the aperture of the C will almost kind of touch at like 14 pixels, 12 pixels. And of course, it goes without saying, no like brush script or display face of this nature should ever be used for body text. It's only meant to be used at display sizes. So the moment you see like any sort of decorative typeface, like a script face or a brush face or a black letter typeface, it's you only use that at large sizes, never at small sizes. So you don't have to remember all of this stuff. You don't have to be a type geek to understand and apply all of these things. You don't have to remember, what is an aperture, what is stroke width. If you're confused about a particular face, you can, most likely head to the website. So if you're taking something from Google Fonts, just head over to Google Fonts, and read a bit about the typeface. The foundry and the designer or the designer will always have at least a small description talking about what is the intended usage of this face. Right? They will majority of the times they state it very clearly. Okay, so if you look at some of these here, so these are just random typefaces I took from my fonts. So if you look at Atelas, it says humanist, open counters. Kohinoor says low contrast. So when you read terms like that, humanist, open counters, low contrast, you know at once it's a body face. That means it works well at small sizes, right? But in some other cases, the designer or the foundry may explicitly say display face, right? So Gilroy, it explicitly says suited for graphic design and any display use. Very rarely you have typefaces that work well at large sizes and at small sizes. So Signo is one in which they say, charismatic typeface for headlines, but it also has an X height and open counters, right? So this is kind of like an exception. But I mean, we can talk about this, in detail probably later. But most of the times, majority of the times, it will be very clear what it's used for. I'm going to move on to the next bit. So display versus body is like the basic question that you can start off with, but there are other things that you can consider when you are selecting your typefaces, right? Starting with the nature of your site content itself, right? Let's say you're designing a site for something like the New York Times, okay, where in which your content is authoritative, right? They have a reputation as being authoritative. They present facts, and it's a news site, so it is concerned with things that happened in the past. And these three attributes are closely associated with serif faces, which is why you see, the New York Times uses mostly serif faces on their website. Contrast that with something like Daring Fireball. So this is one of the leading tech blogs. They focus mostly around Apple News. One of the leading tech blogs. So it is run by one person, John Gruber. So his writing style is a lot more informal. It's a lot more opinion pieces, and that's the subject matter itself is modern, right? It's Apple, it's tech stuff, which makes a sans serif a better choice for a site like that, right? So you have like two different sites, using two different types of typefaces depending on the subject matter. Other considerations. Do I just need Latin characters, or do I need something else? Do I need Devanagari? Do I need Arabic characters? So a lot of times that might determine what typeface you end up choosing, right? So even if you're using something free, like from Google Fonts, right, it still affects your decision. Weights and variants is another thing, right? You'll be surprised to see how many free fonts actually shipped with only like one boldface or maybe one italic face, right? Which is okay for like, if you're using it for something casual. But if you're doing something like editorial work, or you really need like a full range of weights, like you need a hairline and a extra thin, or a semi bold, or a black and an ultra, and those kind of weights, you're better off, looking for a paid typeface, is what I would say, right? So availability of weights and variants also sometimes, makes is something to consider. And of course, if you need fancy stuff like authentic small caps, or you need, swashes, right? Or you need ligatures, authentic ligatures. So all these are open type features, which again, a lot of fonts, you'll be surprised that a lot of fonts don't actually have these. A lot of web fonts, okay? The desktop variants may have them, but the web fonts, they might just strip it out from the web fonts. Other small nuances to consider. Okay, so these are like super nuanced, but worth mentioning. If you're designing a site for a particular philosophy or a cause. Okay, so out of curiosity, I just went to Black Lives Matter, some weeks back, just curious to see what typeface they used and who designed it. So spoiler alert, it is not a black designer; it's a white dude. But I'm just saying that if I designed a website for something like this, the least I would do is at least research typeface designers or type foundries started by black designers. And Darden Studio is a very famous example. They've created typefaces used by I think President Obama in his campaigns. So I'd maybe use something like that at least. If you're creating a website like maybe talking about like feminine poets, or something of that sort, at least select a typeface designed by a woman, right? If you're creating something solely for an Indian audience, right, at least consider using a typeface designed by an Indian designer or at least by an Indian foundry. And I think ITF is doing an excellent job here. So ITF is, I think, based out of Ahmedabad, if I'm not mistaken. But they have like a big collection of very, very high quality typefaces in Devanagari, Tamil, Malayalam, all of these, Indian scripts. And of course, the last nuance that you might want to consider is, of course, cost and the licensing model. So, I mean, I totally understand this is not technically a nuance. Sometimes cost trumps all the other factors, right? Especially if you're working on a site for a client and they really don't have the budget to pay for fonts, then this kind of consideration may trump all the others. But I think it's a nice segue to the last section of what I wanted to talk about, which is licensing and deploying web fonts. So how do you actually go about with this? So given the whole history of web fonts and the long path that we've taken that I just talked about, so today we've kind of arrived at two camps with respect to licensing and deploying. So on the one hand, you have the self-hosted model, which is basically the foundry saying, here you go, here are your fonts. You have to deploy them yourself, right? We just give you the fonts. And on the other side, you have the managed model, which is the Google fonts and the Adobe fonts, which basically they handle the whole licensing aspect of it and the deployment. So both are handled in a managed model. So I'll talk about this in a bit detail a bit later. But I kind of just want to show you where you could go about getting some of these from. So in the first bucket, like the self-hosted bucket, if you're looking for fonts to buy and host yourself, you can just head out directly to the Foundry website, right? Most of the good foundries today sell websites on their own stores. Sell fonts on their own stores. So if you look at like Claim Type Foundry or Type Together, ITF, Dalton Mug, all of them have their own stores. You can just go there and purchase the web fonts directly from them. Or you could go to marketplaces like MyFonts or FontShop or fonts.com. So here you have typefaces, retail faces from hundreds of foundries in one place. So they make it a lot more convenient for you. But in either case, you still have to deploy them yourself. Okay, they just give you the fonts. If you contrast that with the managed model that I just was talking about earlier, so here you essentially pay a recurring cost, and that cost covers both the licensing aspect of it and the hosting aspect of it. Okay, so something like Google Fonts, which is free, but some of these other ones are paid. So Adobe Fonts is the one that I personally use for my own sites and all my hobby projects. Typetura is one I discovered very recently. Hefler has Cloud Typography, and then there are a few others. So in either way, whether you go with the self-hosted model or you go with the managed model, the foundry or the marketplace will always give you a chance to actually try out your typeface. Okay, that's something I recommend very, very highly, especially if you're putting down money or your client is putting down money for a typeface or for a web font. Make sure that you actually try it out. So this is, I think, FontShop. They have a very nice UI for letting you test out, your web fonts. So here you can see you can try out different weights, different variants, different sizes. You can change your alignment, you can change your line height, thickness. So you can really test and see, does this work at body sizes? Does this work at display sizes? Right? Is it a good fit for my site? Before you put down money for it. That's something I highly recommend. So don't look at just the renders that you see on the Foundry websites. Those are not created on the web. Those are created in design tools. So actually test it out. And I just want to end with one last slide with practical kind of costing. So again, this is taken from my own experience using some of these fonts. I found this one typeface called Soleil from Type Together, which I actually found they sell on 3 different places with 3 different models, right? All the 3 that we just talked about. Type Together actually sells this family on 3 different places. So I just considered 2 weights, the book and the bold weight. And this would probably give you a sense of how much to expect in terms of costing, right? If you're looking at paid fonts. So first of all, Type Together sells Soleil on their own website under a perpetual model. Okay, so what does that mean? It means that you can pay 7,000 Indian rupees one time. They give you a perpetual license to Soleil, which means it's yours to keep forever. But you are limited to 10,000 visitors a month on your website. Okay, so that's it. 7,000 rupees one time, but you're limited to 10,000 visitors a month. So the moment your site consistently exceeds like 12,000 or 15,000, you have to go back to them and renegotiate a license with them. The same two weights, book and bold of Soleil, Type Together sell on my fonts under a pay-as-you-go model. So that's a bit different. So how does that work? Pay-as-you-go is literally you pay 6,800 on my fonts, but they don't care how much traffic your site gets. Here you pay for 250,000 page views in total. Okay, so the difference is here you're paying for 10,000 views a month. Here you're paying for 250,000 in total. Okay, so the pay-as-you-go model is actually better for low traffic sites or new sites. Okay, so consider you're doing a brand new website for a client, like it's a new domain name, it's a new website. You have no idea of how much traffic you're going to get. Go with the pay-as-you-go model. Okay, so the first month you may get like 5,000 page views, second month 10,000, third month 15,000. It will still take you many months to hit 250,000. By that time, you will have a fair sense of what is the average traffic that my website gets. And then you can probably go in for a perpetual license, which makes more sense, in the long run. Okay, the perpetual one is built for steady traffic sites in which you have a good idea of what is my average traffic every month. Compared to these two, you have the subscription model, which is the one I use currently with Adobe fonts. So the good part of this is that you don't just get Soleil, Book and Bold, you get thousands of other typefaces as part of a library, like literally thousands more. They again do not care about your page views; it's unmetered. But the only thing is that it's a recurring cost. So I pay something like 4,800 every year. You can also pay it on a monthly basis. I mean, it's good for personal sites. It's good for hobbyists like who I'm always tinkering with, the web fonts on my projects and on my sites. So it makes a lot more sense for me. But this is a recurring cost. So, I mean, I'll just leave it at that. You are probably the best judge of, what your particular project gets in terms of traffic, and other requirements. But these are just the three models that you can use, and this is how they kind of differ in terms of cost. So depending on your traffic, depending on what you're using it for, you can make a decision. So yeah, that's all that I had kind of prepared for this monologue of sorts. Thank you so much for joining in. I'm Karl Fernandes. You can find a little bit more about me as well as contact information on my namesake.com. That's karlfernandes.com. Thanks again, Suvik, Zainab for having me, and Hamza for agreeing to moderate this. Thank you.
Wow, that was excellent. Wasn't that really, really insightful? But I was, I was part nervous for you, Carl. I must admit, like that you're going to cover something as subjective as web typography in a nutshell of 25 minutes. It's not easy. And I think the points you've covered are just so relevant to the audience that's going to be listening to it. And I'm sure that they've got a lot out of it. I actually, like, even though I've been I have learned this quite formally. There were a lot of things that jumped out to me also in this presentation, which was a really nice mix of what you did, which is catering to both novices as well as like experienced designers. So this was a really great presentation. I enjoyed it a lot. So let me get into a kind of an icebreaker question, right? So I
Sure.
know there's possibly more people over here that have not paid for fonts than have paid for fonts, right? So it's almost a designer milestone to get a client to pay for a font. So that first step towards making them pay is an important one. So can you describe like your first experience of actually making a client shell out money for a font and how you convince them?
Yeah. I actually haven't worked with like agency like I worked primarily with agencies in the past. So the clients that we had were kind of large companies. They were typically not like the smaller size brands. So there was one that I worked on like years ago. It was a project for I think Home Center, if I'm not mistaken. So their audience is primarily in India, uh, but also in the UAE. Like it's primarily a brand from the Middle East. So there we needed something that had both Latin characters and Arabic characters, right? So I forget which is the exact family we ended up using, but that, like I said, that was something that simply we could not find, freely available. A good family that had good weights, good variations in both Latin and Arabic. So paid fonts were the only way to go there. But I think, I mean, if you're just looking at like the smaller clients or the smaller brands, I can kind of see like it is a bit difficult to kind of fit something like fonts into the budget, especially because I think like the likes of Google Fonts and others have really raised the bar also in terms of what you can get for free now. So like I remember looking at Google Fonts way back, comparing it with Typekit when I started using Typekit, right? And I was literally appalled by like the quality of typefaces on Google Fonts. But they've come a long way. They have like so many excellent, high quality typefaces. Like the one I've used in this deck is a free one from Google Fonts called Inter. So as you can see, like it's really an excellent typeface. It has so many weights and stuff. So yeah, it is a challenge. I really can't say more than that.
I think that's a good answer where like a good requirement where like free font just doesn't cut it, and especially
Yeah.
with multilingual where you want the families to kind of look together. I think that's a good constraint to kind of make that pitch for a paid font as well. So this is a good time to tell the audience that's listening that use the chat box on this window to post any questions that you want to ask Karl. If you're actually asking from, if you're on the Zoom call right now, you can just request that I unmute you. And I see Akshat, I'm going to get to you right now. So you can just raise your hand and unmute yourself and directly ask that question once we kind of order it. So Akshat, would you like to ask your second question? Your first question?
All right. All right. Perfect. Thank you, Carl. This was such a great presentation. Um, I actually had two questions. Hamza, is that okay if I ask two questions?
Yeah, go for it.
Okay, cool.
Sure.
So, Carl, my first question was, can you talk a little bit about, like, 101 about what vertical rhythm is? And yeah. So, I mean, I have seen the difference vertical rhythm makes when you're using the right fonts and you do it right. The overall, the readability of the page improves a lot and it looks a lot more cleaner. So that's the first question. And the second question I wanted to understand from you is using serif fonts in web applications and like online systems, because that's something that I've not seen a lot.
Yeah.
So like on an e-commerce website, for example. So the fact that you talked about, serif fonts are more authoritative, they are more
Yes.
fact oriented. I completely agree with that, but I've not really seen a lot of designers use that for web apps. I've seen a lot of them, a lot of designers use it for like content websites, like journalistic
Yes.
portals or like blogs and everything else, but not really for web apps and e-commerce sites.
Yeah. Sure. The first question about vertical rhythm, I think it makes a big difference in terms of readability for sure. Like you said, it's a question of using, I think, your CSS wisely and having like a good. So you start off with a good body size. You decide what your body size will be, like whether that's 18 or 20, and then you decide what is your line height, and then everything else is kind of like a factor or multiple of that, like whether it's your padding or whether it's your spacing between paragraphs, all of that stuff.
Right.
In fact, I think Hamza is planning a session around something of this sort in the future.
Yes.
So yeah, maybe that's stuff, that's something we can talk about in detail later, or maybe Hamza, if you want to jump in. Um, but yes, it definitely makes a big difference. Vertical rhythm and spacing. There was this attempt, I think, in the web design community many years ago to actually nail this down very precisely. Actually with
Ah,
grid lines and stuff. But what I think we realized was, with the onset of the responsive web, and widths varying all over the place and images needing to resize, it wasn't really practical to have vertical rhythm nailed down on the web the way you have it in print. Like in print, it is very, very important to have it. And if you look at like any well designed book, you can actually see the difference your consistent vertical rhythm makes. But I think because the web, by virtue of it being a fluid medium, accessible on devices of different sizes and display qualities, it's a little bit more difficult, is what I would say. Um,
Yeah.
perfect. Yeah.
Hamza, you want to talk about about
Yeah,
this before
I
I
think
get to the second thing?
sure. I think we are definitely planning a session where we are looking at how once it's kind of like, this is a great segue. Carl's talk is a great segue to that session, where once you select those typefaces, how do you kind of like size them? What is a system that you follow to kind of make them production level, as well as like use them if you're not working, if you're not developing the thing yourself, how do you kind of hand that off to a developer as well? So we will be covering that in a future session for sure, and that's going to be, and Carl, thank you, this has laid a great ground for that. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
So I'll just give
Sorry,
you
no, I think Akshat had a second
how do you
question.
kind of hand that off to a developer as well? So we will be covering that in a future session for sure, and that's going.
Some sort of echo, I think. Yeah, but I think Akshat had a second question, which I can maybe also answer, regarding serif faces, right? And why we don't see them a lot in web apps. I think the reason is also partly like I actually see them a lot in e-commerce sites, but I think by web apps you mean more like products like maybe Google Analytics or something really uh, like an analytics tool, or like a fintech tool or something maybe like that, is I assume what you're asking. Um, I think the reason is that again, by virtue of serifs being the more historical of the two, like serifs are a lot older than sans serifs. Sans serifs came around a lot later. So by that virtue itself, most of the great typefaces, historically speaking, have always been serifs. So they have this air of authority and this link to the past and this formalness about them, which make them like a better a fit for something like a New York Times or a news site, or any even an e-commerce site. Like if you're a brand, you're a brand trying to establish trust with your users, right, or trust with your customer base, then yes, like definitely go for something with from a serif family. um, yeah,
Yeah.
that's what I would say.
I'm going to ask one question before jumping again to an audience question, which is, I think, unlike like what you had mentioned earlier, which is the history of type is not kind of important, or we're going to rush through that. I think it's wonderful that you covered it for a couple of reasons, because first of all, it was very reminiscent of my graphic designer days, where we used to speak about lino cut and things like that, that were physical artifacts to
Yeah.
print typefaces, right? But for web, I think this context is really important, because it's kind of gearing everything towards the fact that we want to make more performant and accessible like interfaces. Like, so I think that the fact that we covered that is a great thing for this exercise. So is that a lived history for you? Like you mentioned something about like having experienced that. So is that a lived history for you, and how does that kind of like help you today?
Yeah, so if I had to breeze through that because of time constraints, but maybe I can just go back to all this stuff. uh, like a lot of these things I actually have done before, not image replacement. So this was, I think, this used to happen like 2010 or maybe even earlier. But definitely I have done Flash, this happened. I think this started happening just as I was entering into web design, just as I was starting out. So Kufon as well. I actually remember, I think it was Font Squirrel, if I'm not mistaken. Font Squirrel is to actually allow you to upload any desktop
Yeah.
face, and they would give you like this font map out of it, and
Yeah.
and then I remember using all of that stuff. So I think, yeah, in terms of just experiencing all of this, I think it like personally for me, it gives me a better appreciation of the journey that we've had, and just a better appreciation of where we've arrived at, in terms of as an industry. That today, we can just use font face, we can just link to something like a Google Fonts, and it just works. And with all the steps that I think the W3C is taking, right? With there's also, I think, a CSS module now called fonts. The CSS has its own fonts module, if I'm not mistaken. So they're taking like typography very seriously. So the future also looks very bright.
Yeah, if you can go to your web safe font slide, just back a few. I think what's very interesting, because we are moving to more performant interfaces as well, what's very interesting is that these web safe fonts or OS safe fonts are kind of making a comeback because of how performant they also are. Like, where you're kind of like using a sans serif font declaration just so that and this is mostly like a trend that we're seeing more and more in apps and not so much in content websites, where they're just declaring a source serif so that the entire app looks like it's part of your OS, and
Yeah.
so that the native feel of it looks more like that. So it's really nice that while we started with this, it's kind of going a full circle and maybe making a interesting comeback, at least in that app space. So, Pratik, you have a question. Would you like to unmute yourself and take it?
Hey, Prateek.
Hi, Karl. Hi, Hamza.
Hi.
Hey.
Great talk, Karl. Enjoyed it a lot. And yeah, I have two questions.
Sure.
You started off with Oliver's article about 95% of web design being typography, and
Yep.
then we went through a lot of slides about selecting the right typeface and the variations possible. So I wanted to get your thoughts on how much of typography, web typography, do you think is about getting the typeface right, and how much of it is other aspects like Akshat mentioned vertical rhythm, with things like the legibility of the font sizes, the measure, the colors, contrast, and so forth. And the second question was on performance. So one of the legacy methods for using typefaces, which was the flash method, cipher. You pointed out that it would often cause performance issues, and in the current method of using fonts on the web, do we still run into performance issues? Do you have any thoughts about that, or like tips for avoiding performance issues?
Sure. Sure. Yeah, so with respect to the first question, I think with respect to typography on the web, you can look at it at two levels. You have something called macro typography and something called micro typography. So the macro typography refers to what you started off with, which is selecting typefaces, body typefaces, display typefaces. I would also argue, like, at least like having a line height and vertical rhythm. But then you have also the other side of it, which is micro typography, which is the other small things, like using M dashes, the small things that make a difference, like that. So I think it's like an even split, I think. So you have to pay attention to the larger issues of what typeface am I using? Does this resonate with the content that I'm using it for? Right? Is it a good fit for the brand? Balancing all that on the one hand, with also making sure that you nail down like, if there is a character, like if you're writing like something in French, and there's something with a cedilla, actually using a cedilla, using a typeface that has those characters, or those ornaments. So that's all like micro typography that I was talking about. So I think it's a balancing act between both. And yeah, the second one about performance. Yeah, I think with Cipher, it had a big effect on performance. But even with web fonts today, I think there is scope for abuse. If you can't really just go wild with web fonts. I mean, typically, depending on how many characters you have and what character set you're using and how many weights you select, uh, I think on an average, a font kit could come up to like something like maybe 200 kb, at least from my experience. But if you abuse it, you can even take it up to like 900, 800 kb, right? Which then becomes a problem, because then obviously these fonts need to be downloaded before they are rendered. And then you have like we used to have this thing of flash of unstyled text and flash of invisible text and all that kind of stuff. So I think I think that's another technical consideration which maybe I also omitted. uh, Keep performance in mind and just use a subset of only the characters that you need. So if you're looking at it like an English kind of website, choose only the Latin character set. Don't go for extended characters, you know, and use only the weights that you need and the styles that you need. Stick to only that, and really kind of keep the font kit as light as possible.
That's awesome. And I think this kind of segues into my next question also, where you said that like, let's keep it performant, let's have multiple weights and multiple styles, and this still keep it performant. So limit that choice considerably. So what are your thoughts on variable fonts, which is now like the new, the future of typography? And maybe you could also like explain that for people who are not aware of it.
Yeah, sure. Um, yeah, so right at the outset, I just want to say that I don't have experience with variable fonts. I haven't actually tested them out myself, but they are kind of, yeah, they kind of fall somewhere in maybe in this slide. So variable fonts, the technology itself is an update on the OpenType specification. So it's actually like an upgrade on the OpenType specification. So what this allows is, so typically now you have like, let's say inter, right? So you would have inter regular, you would have, suppose you want inter regular, you want inter semi bold, inter bold, right? That's three different fonts, right? So if you go and use a service, or you take the font itself, those are three different, like either OTF files or TTF files, right? With variable fonts, what you have is all three different weights or all three different variants compressed into a single file, right? And it's almost like a matrix, that you can send to your browser in a single font file. So the user can select not just regular, semi bold, and bold, but he can actually select like a whole different like range of weights. Like, so if bold was 400 and semi bold is 600, and sorry, regular is 400, semi bold is 600, and bold is 800, you could even do like something like 750 or 650, right? Because I mean, the mathematics of the vectors are included in that font file. So that basically enables the browser to display any range of weights, display any range of even widths. Like you can combine like a condensed width with a regular width and an ultra wide width in the same font file, and just have the browser use that. So in
And
terms of, yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
do you see yourself using that a lot more in the future, personally?
Yeah. As soon as I get some time to kind of set up a playground and try something out, for sure. Yeah. um, it's definitely something that I think a couple of good sites have already started using it. Yeah, I think when I did my research about it like a few years ago, I think maybe like the browser compatibility, may have been an issue. I don't know how many browsers supported it like 2-3 years back, but now I think support is a lot better, and it also ties in with the whole WAV format. And since most browsers, like you can see, like Chrome 5 and Safari 5, like it's quite good in terms of support. So I think today most browsers that support the WAV format also support variable fonts.
And one thing to the listeners as well, that there is in the Google Fonts like a website, you also, most of the fonts are kind of becoming variable now. So
Yeah.
you can actually select that filter saying show me variable fonts, and it actually gives you that. So that's possibly a good place to kind of start exploring. And
Yeah.
I'm going to put a
There's
plug.
also Roboto. I think Roboto Flex is something on Google Fonts which is already available. So if anyone wants to try it out, you can actually go to Google Fonts and look for Roboto Flex. If I'm not mistaken, it's an actual variable font. Yeah.
Variable font. Okay. Rue had a question, and Rue, would you like to ask it yourself? There is, it just says Rue here. Okay, so let me ask it because they have mentioned it here. They say, how do you say a certain font has enough glyphs?
Okay. So if you go to the actual type foundry, they will always like mention like what is the included glyphs. So if you go to, for example, Google Fonts, I think, and you select like a Cyrillic typeface or something with Devanagari, right? You would see, like, if you go to the actual font detail page, somewhere on the page you would always like look at they will actually show you every single character and glyph that the font includes. So if it's just a Latin face, all you will see is just capital A to capital Z, small a to small z, numerals, and the usual punctuation. But if you have something like a font family that supports multiple languages, then you will see like A to Z, small a to small z, but you will also see all the other characters like Devanagari, Go, all of that stuff. So just I'd say just go to either the service, the font detail page on the service or on the Foundry side, and you'll get a sense of what glyphs are included.
Okay, and she had a follow up, which is what steps could she take to just make sure that the font works for the use case? So if you can give an example of, say, a use case of New York Times, maybe, and then think of like what are you looking for that glyph set when we are looking. Oh, I love
Uh,
that read the label slide, by the way. It's really cool. Yeah, go on.
yeah. So with the New York Times, I'm assuming like that most of their audience is either US based or most of their audience is English speaking. So for me here, it would be a question of balancing performance with the glyphs and the characters that I need. So here, I think, I mean, if I understand the question correctly, I think here you could probably get away with just a Latin or a Latin extended character set. You wouldn't need glyphs like any other glyphs in that. I'm sorry, I don't know if I understood the question correctly. Is that
I
what she
think,
was
yeah,
asking?
no, she said thank you. So, yeah, I think you answered it perfectly. Yeah,
Okay.
but that's an interesting font, interesting font name, interesting point that you raised, which is the point about multilingual, right? So, New York Times, you said it's mostly Latin, but can you tell us, like, say, for example, in India, we're doing a website which is a Latin-based thing, but the client or the requirement from the website is that we need it in Hindi as well. So, what are some of those steps where you've identified this, and then after, as an afterthought, you need to kind of include this new language, right? What are some of the steps that you can do to your files and your layout so that when you switch those typefaces, it kind of works?
Um, yeah, I would say that select. So you already have like a Latin face or a Latin family. So if you're looking for like a Devanagari family to add to that, I would say try to match it as closely to your Latin face in terms of like what is the size of the ascenders and descenders. The overall size of the of the Devanagari face, try to match it as close as possible. So look at a Devanagari face, which side by side with your Latin face, the heights more or less match, the thickness of the strokes of the characters more or less match, right? And the overall metrics are the same. So I mean, if you look at different fonts, a 1.5 line height on font A might be different from a 1.5 line height on a font B, right?
Hmm.
Even though the line height is the same, because of the way the typeface designer designs the metrics of the font, one might be roomier than the other, or one might be more compressed than the other. So ideally, you should use I would just use a super family for something like that. So a family that has both. But if you've not kind of not maybe done that research, or it was an oversight, then just try to match it as closely as possible.
I think you mentioned something about home center and using an Arabic typeface for that. And Arabic is typically right to left,
Right or left?
right?
Yes.
So, how do you kind of manage that when you're creating a layout and you need to find the typeface that works both from left to right in Latin and right to left in Arabic? Like, how did you navigate that problem?
Yeah, so that I think was a kind of a close collaboration between me, the designer, and also the content person, like the person who writes the copy. And it's down to having a discussion about the same copy or the same heading, right? What is it in Arabic? Can we like if the English heading is like 8 words, in Arabic, is it longer than that? Is it shorter than that? And if is a big difference between the two, if it's like down to like the English heading fitting on one line, but the Arabic one needing 2 lines, then I would say like it's a discussion you need to have with the copy person. Maybe can we reduce that, or just designing your header to be flexible to account for both a single line heading or a multi-line heading.
Yeah, got it. And just to remind everyone that we have 10 minutes, 10 odd minutes left on our site, on our webinar right now. So please put your questions in the chat box. I must say that there's a lot of conversation about variable fonts happening in our chat box, as well as some Twitter love for this presentation that has been shared kindly by Zainab for you, Carl. So let me go into my next question, which is when you present something, and I'm guessing that if you're not creating a website for yourself, the fact that you've chosen a certain display typeface and a certain paragraph typeface is still subjective, right? Like, because you're kind of creating it based on certain design principles that you have. But when you pitch it to someone else, how do you make the case for the fact that this is the typefaces you need to go for? And when there is resistance on that end, where there is no, this doesn't work, come back, like, what is your usual process of like pitching a typeface to the person who needs to adopt it, and how do you deal with their feedback?
It begins with like a formal discovery process,
Okay.
in which you ask the brand or the customer, like essentially what is the brand, like what does it communicate, what does it stand for, what is the general personality of the brand, and not just typography, but everything should kind of mirror that or align with that, right? So if you have like a brand something like maybe, yeah, like the New York Times is a good example on one side, but you have something like maybe Airbnb or something very modern, right, on the other side. So the general characteristics of the brand differ a lot. If you have something like Nike, right, versus something like Harley Davidson. So Harley Davidson, like, it stands for a whole set of values like freedom and the open road, right? And Nike is about victory, and perseverance and all those kind of attributes. So trying to kind of align not just typography, but even other things. So I would say that do your research, do a formal discovery, figure out, ask questions if required. Definitely ask questions. But I mean, figure out what the brand stands for, and then apply that in terms of typeface selection. uh, Two books I can highly recommend, if anyone is interested in not just web typography but typography in general. One is The Elements of Typographic Style by Robert Bringhurst. I have both of them on my bookshelf. I think that's the most important book on typography you can read. And a primer for someone just getting started would be Thinking with Type by Ellen Lupton. So I think these two, if you're really interested in aligning typography with an existing brand, I can highly recommend both these books.
That's awesome. And What I was just going to ask you, what are some of those resources? So that's good that you covered that. I found one particular thing super useful, which is the nuances to consider, right? Where you spoke about, and I think that comes through the, like, it breaks down the subjectivity a lot. If you can go into the nuances where you had the Black Lives Matter slide, I found that really interesting because sometimes you want to, it is very heavily based on like a philosophy, or you want to have a hidden story where like the person who's kind of owning the site, which is the client, also kind of jumps at it saying yes, like, because sometimes it does not have to do with how it looks and stuff. Is it the right choice is the question, right? So what is some of the, have you had any experience of doing this activity where you discovered that you went the nuanced way, and what is like an example of that?
Um, No, honestly, there's like there's no example I've personally implemented this with. This is just something that I have kind of read and researched about. I think it was Robert Bringhurst in the book itself. He says that typography should resonate with the audience.
Yeah.
So I mean, it's just one of those things that that literally very few people could probably even notice. Like for me, like to actually find this out, you'd have to actually go to either the style sheet or do an inspect element on their site. I
Yeah.
mean, to most people, like people who are not like typographically inclined, oh yeah, it's just another sans serif they used, or it's just another display face is used. But I mean, to the people who actually dig a little deeper and find out that the face they've used is actually designed by a black studio or by a black typeface designer. I think that makes the whole thing make a lot more sense also.
Yeah. And do you feel that I think Souvik has a question. I'm going to get to that. There is do you feel, this is a controversial question and a subject, but I saw a lot of code in the earlier part of your website, of your presentation, right? So do you feel designers need, how much of CSS, or do you feel it's necessary at all that designers who have no exposure to development know anything about code to do good typography?
Oh, it's a very controversial topic, and I don't know whether I want to dip my feet into that river. But I can just say, like from my personal experience, it has been an immense help that I know HTML. No one's saying you need to know like React and stuff like that, right? But knowing the basics of HTML, like good semantic HTML, knowing the what elements to use, knowing CSS, at least how to apply basic declarations, and just being able to do a very basic kind of design in the browser, right? So you have your design in your render tool, in your Photoshop or your Sketch or Figma, and maybe just knowing enough to at least render something on a page and just test it out in the browser is, I think, what makes a big difference to me. So I won't say whether you should code or you need to know how to code. I can just say that it has helped me a lot, and I think Hamza, you as well, right? Uh, it's been a big help knowing CSS and HTML.
Yeah, for sure. And I would encourage actually quite a few people to just look at only your font declaration CSS things, for because it's just nice to know how line height gets described on the web, and it's almost very similar to any design software like Sketch or Figma that you might be using. So I
Yeah,
think just any of those CSS properties that start with the word font or type would be a good thing to just be aware of, so that, because even variable fonts is moving to using these properties while declaring fonts as well. So I have there's a fun question from Souvik, and I want to add to that question also. His question is, do you miss Typekit, and if yes, how are you coping with it? That's his question. And my question is, thanks for demystifying, or comment is, thanks for demystifying how Adobe pricing works, because ever since Adobe Font has come, I don't understand how a subscription is supposed to be like. God, do I have to pay for one of these apps? And I
yeah,
think yeah, like, it just, I don't need the app, I need the font. So I don't
yes.
understand how this subscription model works. So thanks for covering that, and I'm going to go back and look at it. But I want you to answer Sauvik's question, which is, do you miss Typekit, and how are you coping?
Yeah, I really miss Typekit. So a little bit of history. Like I think I became a customer of Typekit very early on. Like I think 2000 maybe 15 or something, or maybe even earlier. But like basically they started off. I remember with I think $36 a year was where they started off, and then they made it 48 like a few years later, and then the whole Adobe acquisition came and stuff. But yeah, I really miss like the OG Typekit, which was an independent, small independent company, and they had Jason Santamaria as creative director and all these people that we like to follow on Twitter and read about. So I really miss them. So what I'm currently doing with Adobe Fonts is I actually have a subscription to, I think, Adobe InCopy.
Yeah,
Like Hamza, you were saying. So that's the cheapest app that they have in their
exactly.
catalog. Yeah. So I think, like I said in that last slide, for me it comes to around yeah, it's almost like 4,800 a year if you use Adobe InCopy. So I'm just a Creative Suite, Creative Cloud user only for the fonts. So I'm just like using Adobe InCopy. So it's like 300 a month or something, 4,000 something a year.
Okay.
But
Okay.
I really miss like the old Typekit. Yeah.
I think that answers this question as well. So I think you've already pointed out the resources about the technical things like the two books that you recommended. Maybe we'll tweet that out also just as the primer. But I wanted to also know, are there any good web resources that we can kind of point people out to where it might be helpful to kind of like read or look up your website on the look up your fonts on these websites and things like that?
Uh, Off the top of my head, no. I think there is one called A Practical Guide to Web Typography. It's like a microsite. I don't know the exact URL or offhand. But I think if you just Google A Practical Guide to Web Typography, I think you can get
Got
the
it.
website.
Got it. I think,
Um,
yeah. Cool. I think it also like help. There are many sites also like Type in Use and this
yeah, type in
Type
use.
Wolf and things like that where
Yeah.
these are not directly like resources, but they're helpful to just see if your font that you're considering for a project is being used in a
Yes.
website because it gives a better feel of it. So yeah. Uh,
Typewolf, yeah, Typewolf is excellent. If you're looking for just like web font inspiration, Typewolf is excellent. Highly recommend that. Yeah, there's also another one I think called Elements of Typographic Style Applied to the Web.
okay.
So someone has basically taken the book that I was talking about and actually uh, applied it to like the web context. So all the stuff that the book talks about in terms of print, the author has applied it to the web. So that's another one you can also Google.
Awesome. Awesome. This has been super useful, and I'm sure like everyone who's listening agree. I want to thank you, Carl, because I think we have covered all the questions that were there. The chat is full of resources for anyone who's looking, and we probably like make a list of these resources. But there are things about variable type, about the film Helvetica, which is a documentary just about the font Helvetica. It was
Yeah,
so
yeah,
culty that they made a film about it.
yeah.
So I think there's a great discussion happening on the side as well. So thank you so much, Carl, for doing this, and it was so exciting talking to you and nerding out about like typefaces. So this was great. And just for everyone out there, this talk that Carl just gave is part of Content Web, which is a series of talks that are going to be around content websites. So if you want to propose a talk or give ideas, you can go to hasgeek.com/contentweb for submitting your proposals. And if you want to hear about a certain topic, and you want to kind of request a certain topic, I want to hint at variable fonts. So if you want to request something, you can go to Hasgeek Content Web and request the topic as well. There are talks coming every Saturday. These things are perfectly lined up, and there are going to be some interesting topics like e-commerce, HTTP3, and more design and content related talks. And now I have committed also to the typography talk so on publicly, so that's going to be there as well. So thank you everyone. Thank you Zainab, Souvik, Karl, everyone, and we'll see you next Saturday. Bye.
Bye-bye. See you everyone. Thanks.
See you.